This is one of the main conversations that happens when people attempt to reason and debate around transgender issues. In one word, people's minds are absolutely blown. Mutual respect is shattered, and the possibility of positive discourse is lost in an instant. It's amazing. We all know that word, and if you don't, well, you will. It's transphobic.
Transphobia?
Transphobic.
Transphobic. What the hell is transphobia? I think that most people feel that they have an idea of what it would or what they think that it should mean, but not entirely what it actually means, and also without the nuance. So judging from the reactions that people usually give upon being called this word, I think that most people view it to mean afraid of trans people. And generally speaking, that is exactly what it means, but not always on the same scale that I feel that people imagine in their minds. So I coined myself to be a very rational person. I'm also very emotional, but I think that people should be multidimensional, and so I'm also very, very rational. So I can see clearly how people get to that definition, simply by dissecting the word. So we look at trans. Okay, people can kind of get that, more or less. Like, a baby is born, the doctor declares the gender as boy or girl, but they never agreed with that, and so they live their life as the other gender because it makes more sense for them. Okay, we kind of get that. But phobic, that instantly makes people's minds go all the way somewhere else. And so they start imagining words like arachnophobia, agoraphobia, claustrophobia, and then they think of terror. Now, if you look up the word phobia, you'll find it defined as an extreme or irrational fear of or aversion to something. So if claustrophobia is extreme and irrational fear or aversion to small places, then transphobia would mean an extreme and irrational fear or aversion to trans people. And since most people don't feel like their fear is extreme, nor do they feel it to be irrational, that's why people have such a hard time accepting this word, which ultimately makes it impossible for them to be reflective of their actions. They don't feel like that shit applies to them, so they just scrunch up and say, nah, you got the wrong guy. I'm not transphobic, or what you mean transphobic? I'm not scared of trans people.
Like, I ain't scared
I'm not
of y'all.
scared of nobody.
Y'all
And then from this very defensive place, it makes it impossible to get some real talking done. Because now both sides are just pissed at each other and they want to let it be known. Now, do I feel like a lot of people who swear up and down that they're not transphobic actually are? Fuck yeah. But maybe not to the degree that the original understanding of the word implies. It's kind of like if you're driving while black, right? And the boys pull up behind you, the cops, and they pull you over when you're in a nice neighborhood. Is that racist? Or how about if you walk past somebody's car, maybe at night or maybe even not, and they lock their doors as you go by? Is that racist? Or how about if a clerk checks your $100 or maybe even $50 bill just a little too long? Is that full-on racism? Some people will argue again, fuck yeah it is. But if you were to ask those people themselves, I guarantee you 99% that they would absolutely refute that. I'm not a racist. I don't have anything against anybody. I just did it without thinking. That's my job. It didn't have anything to do with him being black or whatever. I don't even think like that. I don't even see color, you know? Because in their mind, what they did wasn't that bad. And when they hear the word racist, their mind goes to something extreme. Maybe they know racists or even have one or some in their family. So they're imagining like fire hoses, nooses, and pointed hoods, which they, comparatively, are a far stretch away from, which makes them feel like unworthy candidates to be on the receiving end of such an ugly, ugly word. This is the exact line of thinking that people have when they're called transphobic. They think of transphobia as whatever horrible thing that they think. And then they feel themselves very logically, almost as if it's obvious that they would or should be averse to transness because it's not the norm. So basically it's like, okay, so this is what most people do. And then there's that, which is some whole other stuff in people's minds. So they like, it just makes sense that I wouldn't feel all the way okay with that because it's not what most people, including myself, would ever do. So you need to be okay with me not being okay with that. So calling them transphobic is like calling the people in the other example racist. They feel like it's not that they are bad, Sometimes it's just their implicit worldview. So then they feel like you're trying to say that they're wrong for personally feeling how they feel, and no one wants to ever feel control, like their literal personal space is being invaded. And so from there, in their minds, they have no choice but to fight back. Now, do I feel like the people in the examples before could be justifiably called racist? Well, yes and no. There's a difference between what would be considered like a microaggression and straight up racism. Do I feel like all of that micro shit is part of racism? Hell yeah, I do. But it's like a toe on the behemoth of a body that is racism itself. But it's still just a toe, you know? Those small things themselves aren't as bad as the deeper places that they come from, which a lot of times can be pretty dark and fucked up. So when someone says something like they wouldn't date a trans person, or they say that young people shouldn't be thinking about trans or gender or anything like that, and they get called transphobic, what they're doing in that moment might be micro, like a microphobia, but it's still oftentimes stemming from a very serious place. Unfortunately, many of us are familiar with the fact that every year in this country and around the world, trans people, trans women, especially trans women of color, are harmed or killed just for daring to exist publicly. Because some person, somewhere, thought that that was such an outrageously unacceptable act that they took it upon themselves to end that person's life. Unfucking believable. But it does unfortunately happen. And these people feel like that could be the extent of the hellishness that they could unleash if they wanted to take it there. But since they're not, and they're just having a conversation about their opinion, no matter how harsh or matter of fact that it may be, saying that they're transphobic doesn't sound appealing to them. That's the thing about language, you know, it's slippery and it can be clumsy. And, you know, with every word, there are at least three meanings, you know? There's your understanding of the word, my understanding of the word, and then the actual definition of the word, which sometimes has several definitions in and of itself. So even though that I feel the word transphobia has its utility and should not be done away with, I think that it would be largely effective to call a duck a duck. Never am I trying to water down the severity of the ugly ideology that is transphobia. It's just that I've been having much more success in conversation by explaining the action more than encapsulating it all into one word. So if a person shows some varying degree of disgust or whatever towards the idea of dating a trans person, for example, I say, you really seem to not be a fan of the way that you think trans people look. Or if someone gets upset about other trans issues being widely spoken about, I tell them, you seem to be really against the idea of conversations of trans people happening in media. Or I'll ask something along the lines of, you seem kind of pissed right now. What about this issue makes you feel some type of way? So basically, I try to find a way to call upon the exact action that I see them doing in that moment, in a way that A, is not so easily able to be run away from, and B, they can understand without becoming defensive, you know? Or if I do use the word transphobic, directly followed by it, I'll give them the definition. So I usually say, you have an aversion to or a noticeable dislike of trans people. And that's what transphobia mostly is, correct me if I'm wrong. A noticeable dislike of trans people. And I find when it's said like that, there's a lot more conversation that stems from the interaction. Now, I do understand that not everyone is gonna have this approach, you know? Sometimes when a person is being nasty towards you or is delegitimizing your entire community and identity, that can be upsetting to the point of going beyond rational discourse or any of that old clever wording bullshit. And the gloves just come right off. The same way that if I was dealing with a racist and they were saying slurs and certain things at me, it would be difficult to remain calm and find a way to make them understand, because I'd just be like, fuck you in that moment, you know? And while sometimes some people can be so vile that I feel the same way when I'm having conversations about trans people with them, for the most part, being that I'm an ally, I get to be about one tick of separation from their shitty comments. And that allows me to be able to approach it in a way that can be potentially, you know, it just can potentially get people to see things from a different perspective. That's the beauty of being an ally. The proximity to the person or group who is full of fear and misunderstanding, and also a similar proximity to the group that you're advocating for. We all have to pick up the pitchforks and ride out for each other, because until we are all free, none of us is free. For real. But let me know what you think about this word in the comments below. Have you ever been called transphobic, or have you ever heard the word and felt on edge? What do you think about the way that it's used, and what do you think is the best way to have these conversations with the highest success rate? I don't have all of the answers. I don't pretend to have all of the answers. So I would love to hear your input. Let me know.